Picture for a moment the sound that would change everything. Not the clash of steel or the roar of a crowd, but the definitive, shuddering thud of a massive wooden door being barred shut. That sound echoes through cold, dark stone corridors, and in that moment, the world shrinks, the horizon vanishes, replaced by the limits of a fortress wall. For the men, women, and even children inside, this sound meant their fate was sealed, not for days, but for months or even years, trapped in a state of suspended animation where death was the constant neighbor just outside the gates. We know the dates of these sieges, the names of the castles, the strategies of the generals, but what was it truly like to be the person living through that unimaginable pressure? The answer lies not in grand historical chronicles, but in the most intimate of sources, the fragile, often overlooked personal diaries of those who were there. These journals are our only direct line into the besieged mind, and they reveal a story far more complex and human than any battle plan could ever convey. Today, we are going on a journey into that confined world, exploring what we're calling the siege within. We will move beyond the battlements and the strategies to uncover the profound psychological toll of that life under lockdown. Through these forgotten pages, we will meet people just like us, individuals grappling with fear, sustaining themselves with hope, and displaying breathtaking ingenuity in the face of utter deprivation. We'll discover the surprising routines of daily life that stubbornly persisted, the meals cobbled together from nothing, the prayers whispered in the chapel, the games children played in the shadow of siege engines. This is not just a history lesson, it is an exploration of human resilience at its most extreme. These whispers from the past hold up a mirror to our own capacity to endure, making their stories startlingly relevant to our understanding of stress, community, and survival even today. So prepare to step inside the walls. Prepare to understand how the greatest battle of a siege was often fought not with swords and arrows, but with the human spirit itself. This is a story of how people coped when the world closed in on them, a narrative woven from fear, faith, and the faint but unyielding flame of hope. It's a journey into the heart of what it means to be trapped, and more importantly, what it means to remain human in the face of overwhelming odds. Let's begin. But before we can hear those voices, we have to find them. And the story of these diaries is itself a kind of detective tale, one that starts far from the clamor of ancient battlefields. It begins in the hushed silence of libraries, in the dust-filled attics of old manor houses, and deep within the archaeological layers of castle restoration projects. Imagine a historian, gloves on, carefully lifting a bundle of papers from a forgotten chest that hasn't been opened in centuries. The leather binding is fragile, the pages are thin and brittle as autumn leaves, and the ink has faded to a faint brown. In that moment, the potential for a direct connection to the past is electric. These weren't documents meant for public record. They were private thoughts, hurriedly scrawled by candlelight, often hidden away by their authors for reasons we can only guess. Perhaps they were tucked into a family Bible, sealed within a wall for safekeeping, or simply passed down through generations as a sacred, painful heirloom. Discovering them is only the first step. The real work is in the painstaking process of authentication, a scientific and historical puzzle. Experts must analyze the paper or vellum itself. Where was it made? Does its composition match the time period? They study the ink, its chemical makeup offering clues about its age. But perhaps most telling is the handwriting. Scribes had distinct styles that changed over the decades, and comparing the script to other verified documents from the same era is crucial. It's a meticulous cross-referencing of every detail to answer one vital question. Is this a genuine window to the past or a clever forgery? When a diary is confirmed as authentic, it's a monumental event for historians. Official chronicles of the time were written by monks or court officials, focusing on the deeds of kings, the strategies of generals, and the overall flow of battle. They give us the what and the when, but they almost entirely ignore the how did it feel. These personal journals provide that missing emotional heartbeat. They are the counter-narrative to the grand, sweeping stories of history. While a king's chronicle might state, the siege lasted 120 days, a diary entry from inside the walls might read, today we boiled the last of the leather straps. Little Marguerite cried for bread, and there was none to give her. The silence from the enemy camp is more frightening than their war drums. Suddenly, the statistic is transformed into a human experience. The survival of these fragile manuscripts against centuries of war, fire, and simple neglect feels like a minor miracle. It's as if the past itself is insisting that these individual stories, these testimonies of ordinary people under extraordinary pressure, are too important to be lost. They have endured for a reason, and that reason compels us to listen closely, to step through the doorway they provide and finally ask the question, what was daily life actually like when your entire world was reduced to the space inside a stone wall? And then the horizon changed. For days, perhaps, there had been rumors, whispers carried by frantic messengers or seen in the distant smoke of burning villages. But nothing could truly prepare the inhabitants of a fortress for the moment the threat became visible. It often began as a dust cloud, a dark smudge on the edge of the world that slowly resolved into a moving, glittering mass. The first diary entries from this precise moment are some of the most powerful, written with a raw, disorienting panic that leaps off the page even centuries later. One such account, from a scribe trapped inside the formidable Château How Gaillard during the siege of 1204, describes the scene as night fell. He writes of seeing not just an army, but a seemingly endless constellation of enemy campfires springing to life, each one a pinprick of light that collectively formed what he called a, quote, sea of stars that promised only darkness, unquote. It was a breathtakingly poetic image for a moment of sheer terror, capturing the awful beauty and the absolute finality of their encirclement. The response inside the walls was immediate and frantic. The normal, slow rhythm of castle life shattered. Gates that had stood open for trade and travel were slammed shut. Their heavy iron bars dropped into place with a sound that echoed through the entire fortress, a definitive note of separation. There was a desperate rush to finalize preparations that might have been ongoing for weeks. Servants and soldiers alike scrambled to haul in the last remaining livestock from the outer baileys, to secure every last sack of grain from the mills, and to position barrels of water at strategic points in case of fire. The castle's commander and his officers would be racing from one vantage point to another, trying to assess the size of the force arrayed against them, identifying the siege engines being constructed, and making frantic calculations. How long could their supplies last? How many fighting men did they have? These first hours were a blur of urgent activity, a physical manifestation of the psychological shock that was settling over everyone. The most profound change, however, was not physical but mental. The world, which had once stretched for miles in every direction, suddenly and violently shrank. The horizon was no longer a promise of adventure or connection. It was now a hard line defined by the enemy's pickets. The vast sky above was now just a rectangle of blue viewed from a crowded courtyard. This radical contraction of space induced a kind of claustrophobia that went beyond the stone walls. Every diary from this initial phase speaks to this feeling of being trapped, of the walls themselves seeming to press inward. The familiar landscape of home had become a prison, and the open fields beyond were now a deadly no-man's land. This psychological shift from a life of relative freedom to one of extreme confinement was as sudden as it was terrifying, forcing every single person, from the highest lord to the lowest servant, to confront their deepest fears of starvation, capture, and death head-on. In the face of this new reality, the pages of these journals become filled with two things: pragmatic lists and desperate prayers. You see hurried calculations of food supplies, so many bushels of wheat, so many sides of salted beef, so many casks of wine, with anxious notes questioning if it will be enough. Alongside these grim inventories are fervent pleas to God and the saints. The writing is often rushed, the script uneven, betraying the author's trembling hand. They are trying to impose order on chaos through numbers and seek solace from the divine, all at the same time. This combination of practical survivalism and spiritual hope reveals a community being violently thrust from a state of peace into a state of perpetual high alert. The old routines were gone, replaced by a terrifying new normal where the sound of a distant trumpet could send a shiver through the entire population. This collective trauma, this shared experience of sudden peril, would immediately begin to reshape the very fabric of the society trapped within the walls, setting the stage for the complex and often strained social hierarchy that would determine their fate in the long days to come. Once the initial shock of encirclement subsided, a new, more insidious reality set in for those trapped within the fortress walls. The familiar feudal order, a pyramid of authority that had structured every aspect of medieval life, was thrown into a state of extreme and unpredictable flux. The lord or castellan, who once wielded power from a distance, was now living in unbearably close quarters with his entire community, and his every decision was suddenly a matter of public and often desperate scrutiny. A journal from the siege of Rochester Castle describes how the castellan's daily inspection of the walls became a kind of theatrical performance. The way he carried himself, the tone of his voice, even the expression on his face were dissected by soldiers and servants alike for signs of confidence or fear. His authority was no longer an abstract concept granted by birthright. It became a tangible force measured in practical outcomes and perceived competence. A leader who appeared hesitant when assessing a damaged section of the wall could send a wave of panic through the garrison, while one who calmly issued orders for its repair could solidify his command more effectively than any royal decree. This pressure cooker environment forced a pragmatic and often uncomfortable blurring of social lines that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Diaries from numerous sieges record the profound social dislocations that occurred. Knights, trained for mounted combat and accustomed to a certain station, found themselves bunking in crowded barracks alongside common-born archers and crossbowmen. The sound of snoring and the smell of unwashed bodies became great social equalizers. Perhaps even more revealing are the accounts involving noblewomen. A lady who had spent her life directing a household of servants might suddenly be found in the kitchens, not overseeing, but actively grinding grain or tending to a vast cauldron of thin stew. Her soft hands, unused to labor, would grow raw and blistered. One remarkable entry from a lady's maid during a lengthy siege in France notes with astonishment how her mistress insisted on taking a turn at the laundry, scrubbing bloodied bandages alongside women she would normally only address with commands. This was not born of a sudden belief in equality, but of sheer, undeniable necessity. There were simply not enough hands, and survival demanded that every pair contribute, regardless of their owner's pedigree. This forced proximity created what we might now call strange bedfellows, alliances and interactions that defied the rigid social code. A lowly carpenter with a knack for engineering might find himself in daily consultation with the castle's marshal. A cook's knowledge of preserving food could make her advice as valuable as that of a knight. These practical collaborations subtly eroded the foundations of the class system, creating a new, situational hierarchy based on skill and usefulness rather than solely on birth. For the medieval mind, this was profoundly unsettling. The social order was believed to be divinely ordained. To see it bending and twisting under pressure challenged deeply held beliefs about the way the world should work. It created a constant, low-grade social tension that ran parallel to the more obvious threat of the enemy outside. Trust became a complicated currency, no longer automatically given to one's social superiors but earned through action and shared hardship. Consequently, the microcosm of society within the fortress became a relentless crucible for leadership. The Lord's ability to manage not just the physical defenses, but also this volatile social landscape was paramount. A weak or indecisive leader, one who hoarded the last of the good wine for himself or showed favoritism to his noble companions, could see morale disintegrate overnight. Diaries speak of muttered grievances turning into open defiance, of guards accidentally falling asleep on watch, of vital tasks going undone out of a silent, collective protest. Conversely, a lord who shared the same meager rations as his men, who walked the walls at all hours, and who made a show of fairness in distributing tasks, could inspire a loyalty so fierce that men would fight to the death for him. This was leadership stripped bare, judged not by title but by character under duress. The fortress became a sealed laboratory of human dynamics, where the pressures of survival amplified every strength and exposed every flaw, a theme that would find its most critical expression in the next great challenge, the brutal, unending mathematics of rationing and hunger. As the initial shock of encirclement faded into a grim routine, a new and far more insidious enemy began its assault from within the fortress walls. This adversary was not armed with sword or spear, but with an empty, gnawing sensation that would come to dominate every waking thought and haunt every sleeping moment. The passage of time was no longer marked by the changing position of the sun, but by the gradual, terrifying depletion of the food stores. The diaries from this phase of a siege undergo a stark transformation. The entries become shorter, more focused, and consumed by a single, all-powerful theme: the agonizing reality of hunger and the meticulous, often brutal, system of rationing that attempted to manage it. The grand strategies of defense and the nuances of social hierarchy began to pale in comparison to the simple, overwhelming need for sustenance. A commander's primary role shifted from military tactician to chief rationing officer, his authority now measured in ounces of bread and sips of watered wine. The pages of these journals read like a slow-motion inventory of despair. Authors meticulously document the incremental reductions that defined their new existence. An early entry might note with concern that the daily bread ration has been cut by a quarter. Weeks later, another entry describes how the communal stew, once thick with barley and chunks of mutton, has become little more than a weakly flavored broth, with a single turnip or a handful of lentils now having to stretch to feed a dozen people. The disappearance of meat is a common and deeply symbolic milestone. The last salted pork or beef would be consumed with a sense of finality, a tangible marker that the fortress was living on borrowed time. One of the most poignant examples comes from an account of the siege of Kenilworth Castle in 1266, where a diarist describes the communal division of a single salted fish among 20 individuals. The fish was carefully filleted, with every scrap of flesh accounted for, and then the head, tail, and skeleton were not discarded. Instead, they were placed into a large pot and boiled for hours, not once, but repeatedly, to extract every last vestige of flavor and nutrition, creating a thin, briny liquid that was called soup but offered little real sustenance. This was the grim arithmetic of survival, where every calorie was counted and every scrap was assigned a value. Beyond the physical weakening, the psychological torment described in these accounts is utterly palpable. The human mind, deprived of adequate nourishment, turns in on itself. Diarists write of being haunted by vivid, waking dreams of feasts they had enjoyed in the past. They would describe in painstaking detail the succulent taste of a roasted capon, the crisp skin of a freshly baked loaf, the rich sweetness of a summer pear, as if by writing it down they could somehow conjure the memory into reality. This constant mental fixation on food became a form of torture in itself, a cruel trick of the starving brain. The sound of a distant church bell could be mistaken for a dinner gong, triggering a momentary surge of hope followed by crushing disappointment. The green of a weed growing between the courtyard stones could look, for a fleeting second, like a patch of parsley, sparking a desperate lunge. This all-consuming hunger began to erode the very social fabric that had been so carefully maintained. The bonds of loyalty and community, strained by proximity and fear, were now tested by the most primal of instincts. Suspicion became a contagion as potent as any disease. Who was getting a slightly larger portion? Was the bread being divided fairly? The person tasked with distributing the rations held a position of immense power and was often viewed with a mixture of dependence and deep distrust. Diaries from this period are filled with whispers of theft and favoritism. A servant might be accused of pocketing a handful of grain. A knight might be suspected of receiving an extra cup of wine from a sympathetic storekeeper. These accusations, whether true or not, fractured the fragile sense of unity. The fight for individual survival began to override the collective need for solidarity. A stolen crust of bread could lead to a violent confrontation between men who had, just weeks before, stood shoulder to shoulder on the battlements. The management of hunger was therefore not just a logistical challenge, it was a daily battle for the moral fiber of every individual, a struggle that pitted the civilized self against the raw will to live. It was in the crucible of this extreme scarcity, however, that the human capacity for ingenuity and adaptation truly ignited, leading to a desperate and often surprising culinary inventiveness that would become their only defense against total collapse. And so, with the grim mathematics of rationing dictating their every move, the inhabitants of these besieged fortresses were forced to become culinary alchemists, transforming the inedible into the barely palatable. This was not merely a matter of eating less, it was a radical reinvention of what constituted food itself. The pages of the more practical diaries that survive read like surreal cookbooks from the edge of existence, filled with recipes born of pure, unadulterated necessity. They document a systematic scavenging of the confined environment, where every living creature and every fibrous plant was assessed for its caloric potential. Rats and mice, once pests to be exterminated, became prized catches, their meat providing a rare, if meager, source of protein. Pigeons that nested in the high towers were carefully trapped, and even dogs and cats, beloved companions in better times, could tragically become part of the food chain when the shadows of starvation grew long. The most desperate measures, however, involved turning to the very materials of their daily lives. Leather, a substance never meant for consumption, became a last resort ingredient. Diarists describe the meticulous process of cutting belts, straps, and even the soles of old boots into small strips. These would then be boiled for hours, sometimes for an entire day, in an attempt to break down the tough fibers. The result was a thin, gelatinous broth that offered little nutritional value but could trick a starving stomach into feeling a fleeting sense of fullness. The act of consuming this leather soup was a powerful symbol of how far they had fallen, a stark line crossed in the fight for survival. Yet even this was approached with a degree of culinary ceremony. If a precious onion or a handful of herbs could be spared, it would be added to the pot, a feeble attempt to impart some semblance of flavor to the unpalatable concoction. Alongside this protein hunt, a parallel and equally vital activity was underway within the fortress walls: intensive foraging. The courtyards, gardens, and even the cracks between the stone paving slabs became a new kind of landscape, one to be scrutinized not for its beauty but for its hidden sustenance. Knowledge of wild plants, once the domain of rural peasants, became essential knowledge for everyone. People learned to identify edible weeds like nettles, which could be boiled to neutralize their sting and provide a green, spinach-like vegetable. Dandelion leaves, sorrel, and chickweed were gathered with the care of a master chef selecting ingredients for a fine salad. Roots of certain plants were dug up and roasted, and bark was sometimes scraped from trees to be ground into a bitter, fibrous flour. One particularly remarkable diary entry from a 14th century siege describes the creation of a hearty pottage made not from barley or peas, but from a foraged haul of nettles, dandelions, and acorns. The acorns were a key ingredient, requiring extensive processing to leach out their natural tannins before being ground into a coarse, nutty meal that could thicken the stew. The diarist notes with a touch of pride how it was seasoned with wild thyme they discovered growing in a sunny corner of the inner ward, a small detail that speaks volumes. This ingenuity was far more than a biological imperative. It was a profound act of psychological and cultural defiance. The act of preparing a meal, however strange the ingredients, was a ritual that maintained a thread connecting them to their former lives. Sitting down to share a bowl of nettle pottage, however thin, was a way of asserting that they were still a community, still human beings who observed the customs of dining together, rather than mere animals fighting over scraps. It was a stubborn refusal to let deprivation strip away all traces of civilization. This culinary creativity was a battle fought with pots and pans, a quiet insistence on order and ingenuity in the face of chaos. It demonstrated that even when the body was weakened, the human mind could still problem solve, still find pockets of resourcefulness in the most barren of environments. This determination to nurture the body against all odds was mirrored by an equally powerful drive to nurture the soul, a need that found its most consistent expression in the rhythms of faith and daily prayer that echoed through the stone chambers of the fortress. In a world reduced to the stark geometry of stone walls and the ever-present threat of violence, the one space that offered a different kind of refuge was the fortress chapel. This small church, often tucked into a corner of the inner ward, became far more than a place of worship. It was the emotional and spiritual heart of the besieged community, a sanctuary for minds buckling under the strain of endless confinement. The rigid, predictable schedule of the daily divine offices, the canonical hours of prayer like matins at dawn, lauds in the early morning, and vespers as evening fell, imposed a desperately needed rhythm onto a life that had otherwise descended into chaotic suspense. For people whose every day was defined by the unpredictable sounds of siege engines and shouted alarms, the regular calling of the bells to prayer was a profound anchor. It was a sound that promised order, a reminder that the universe still operated under a divine plan, even if their own small corner of it had descended into hell. The collective act of gathering, of chanting familiar psalms and prayers in unison, created a powerful wave of communal solace, a temporary shield against the isolating fear that gripped each individual soul. The nature of prayer itself, as revealed in these diaries, underwent a dramatic transformation during a siege. The formal, recited prayers of peacetime gave way to intensely personal, raw, and often desperate conversations with God and the saints. Diarists wrote of begging for intercession, not with the detached piety of a Sunday service, but with the fervent bargaining of someone staring into the abyss. A knight might pray to St. George not just for courage, but for a specific, tangible sign, a break in the clouds, the sight of a friendly bird, anything that could be interpreted as a promise of deliverance. A mother would plead with the Virgin Mary to protect her children, making specific promises of pilgrimage or devotion if they were only spared. This personalized faith was a coping mechanism of immense power. It gave people a sense of agency in a situation where they were largely powerless, a feeling that through the intensity of their belief, they could somehow influence their fate. It transformed their suffering from a meaningless ordeal into a test of faith, a spiritual trial with a potential reward in the afterlife, if not in this one. The clergy trapped inside the walls found their roles expanded far beyond their traditional duties. A priest or monk was no longer just a conduit to the divine. He became a crucial pillar of practical and psychological support. He moved among the people, hearing confessions that were less about sin and more about fear, offering words of comfort to the wounded and the grieving. But his role often became even more hands-on. Many men of the cloth had basic knowledge of herbal remedies and wound care, and diaries frequently mention priests and monks assisting the overworked surgeons, binding wounds and offering what comfort they could to the dying. This dual role, tending to both the soul and the body, made the clergy indispensable. They were living embodiments of the hope they preached, their presence a constant physical reassurance that God had not abandoned them within their stone prison. Their leadership helped to frame the entire siege not as a mere military conflict, but as a cosmic drama, a battle between good and evil, with their fortress as a bastion of faith. This framework of faith was the primary defense against the despair that constantly threatened to overwhelm the population. When rations grew thin and the enemy's taunts echoed across the walls, it was the belief in a higher purpose and a final heavenly reward that kept many from surrendering to utter hopelessness. The rituals of the church, the lighting of candles, the scent of incense, the taste of the communion wafer, provided sensory experiences that were clean, orderly, and holy, a stark contrast to the grime, blood, and fear that defined their daily existence. This unwavering belief system offered a narrative of hope that was far more resilient than any temporary military success. It allowed people to endure the unendurable by placing their suffering within a larger, divine context. Yet, this spiritual fortitude was perpetually tested by a much more tangible and silent enemy that respected no sanctuary and could not be repelled by prayer alone: the relentless scourge of disease which thrived in the very conditions the siege created. But while faith offered solace for the soul, a far more visceral and inescapable enemy was often brewing within the fortress walls themselves. In the grim arithmetic of a prolonged siege, the sword and the arrow were often less deadly than the silent, creeping threat of disease. It's a chilling historical reality that during many of these ordeals, more people ultimately perished from illness than from direct combat. The diaries from these periods provide harrowing, first-hand testimony to the swift and merciless spread of sickness in an environment perfectly designed for its propagation. Think of the conditions: hundreds of people crammed into a confined space with primitive sanitation. Water sources, often cisterns collecting rainwater, could easily become contaminated. Waste disposal was a constant, desperate problem, with latrines overflowing and makeshift pits dug in corners of the courtyards. In this fetid atmosphere, diseases like dysentery, typhus, and various respiratory infections found a fertile breeding ground, sweeping through the population with terrifying speed. The medical knowledge available to confront these crises was, by our modern standards, extremely limited and rooted in a mixture of ancient theories and folk practices. The dominant understanding of medicine was based on the concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and illness was thought to be caused by an imbalance among them. Treatments, therefore, aimed at restoring this balance through methods like bloodletting or purging, which often did more harm than good to patients already weakened by hunger and stress. The diaries reveal a world where diagnosis and treatment were a confusing blend of the practical and the supernatural. A physician, if one was present, might examine a patient's urine for color and consistency, while a local wise woman might recommend a charm or a prayer to a specific saint known for healing. There was no understanding of germs or viruses. Instead, sickness was often attributed to miasma or bad air rising from rot and decay. This led to a fascinating and sometimes accidentally effective approach to treatment that combined herbal wisdom with sheer desperation. One remarkable example comes from the journal of an apothecary trapped during a siege of a French castle in the 14th century. His entries detail the frantic creation of poultices made from moldy bread, which he would apply to festering wounds and deep abscesses. Unbeknownst to him, he was harnessing the antibacterial properties of certain molds, a crude and unintentional precursor to the discovery of penicillin centuries later. He also wrote extensively about the constant burning of aromatic herbs like sage, rosemary, and juniper on small braziers placed throughout the living quarters. The intention was to purify the foul air, to drive away the miasmic vapors that were believed to cause disease. While this was based on a flawed theory, the practice would have had a mild antiseptic effect, helping to cleanse the air of some pathogens, and at the very least masking the overwhelming stench of sickness and death, which was itself a source of profound psychological distress. The constant presence of the ill and the dying added a layer of horror to siege life that was uniquely corrosive to morale. Diarists describe the sounds of the sickbay, the relentless coughing from respiratory infections, the moans of those racked with the bloody flux of dysentery, the whispered prayers of the dying. The smell was inescapable, a thick cocktail of sweat, vomit, and infection that permeated the stone walls. For those who were still healthy, tending to the sick was a duty fraught with fear, as every contact risked contagion. The helplessness felt in the face of a raging fever or a wasting disease was profound. You could stand on the walls and defy an army, but you were powerless against the invisible enemy within. This forced every individual to confront their own mortality not as an abstract concept, but as an immediate physical possibility. The sight of a neighbor or a child succumbing to a plague was a daily reminder that death could come just as easily from a shared cup of water as from an enemy archer. This intimate, constant acquaintance with mortality shaped the mental state of the besieged in profound and lasting ways. It bred a kind of grim fatalism alongside a fierce clinging to life. Some diaries become more philosophical, their authors reflecting on the fragility of the human body and the fleeting nature of earthly glory. Others reveal a heightened appreciation for any moment of health or comfort, no matter how small. The psychological toll was immense, contributing to a state of collective trauma where despair was always waiting at the edges of consciousness. It was this oppressive atmosphere, this need to escape not just the physical confines but the psychological weight of sickness and death, that drove people to seek refuge in the one realm that disease could not touch, the world of the imagination, giving rise to a vital culture of artistic expression and storytelling as a means of sheer mental survival. Yet, amidst the ever-present shadow of disease and the gnawing emptiness of hunger, the human spirit demonstrated a remarkable capacity to create its own light. The psychological strain of endless confinement and the constant proximity to death demanded an outlet, a means of escape that no enemy could breach. Within the cold stone walls, the inhabitants of these besieged fortresses turned instinctively to the oldest and most powerful tools of mental survival: art, music, and storytelling. These were not mere diversions or idle pastimes. They were vital, life-sustaining acts of defiance, a conscious nurturing of the inner world when the outer world had become a prison. The Great Hall, which might have once hosted grand feasts, now often served as a makeshift theater, a sanctuary for the mind. Diaries from various sieges frequently mention the haunting sound of a lone minstrel's lute or viol, its melody weaving through the cavernous space. These musicians would perform old, familiar ballad songs of chivalrous knights, tragic romances, and faraway pastoral landscapes. For a few precious moments, the listeners were transported. The relentless thunder of trebuchets and the shouts from the walls were momentarily drowned out by a melody that spoke of a different, more beautiful reality. This wasn't just entertainment. It was a form of collective therapy, a shared auditory journey away from their shared nightmare, reminding everyone of the culture and beauty they were fighting to preserve. This creative impulse extended to quieter, more meticulous pursuits as well. In some fortresses, particularly those housing a monastery or a noble household with a resident scribe, the painstaking art of illuminating manuscripts continued even under siege. Imagine a monk hunched over a small wooden desk in a dimly lit scriptorium, his hand guided by the flickering light of a single candle. While the world outside descended into chaos, he would focus all his concentration on the intricate swirl of a capital letter, the delicate application of gold leaf to a biblical scene, or the careful shading of a floral border. For the scribe, this work was a form of meditation, an intense focus that allowed his mind to retreat from the fear and uncertainty. The very act of creating something beautiful and permanent in the midst of such ephemeral violence was a profound statement of hope. Each completed page was a victory, a small island of order and sanctity in an ocean of chaos. It asserted that the human drive to create could, even if only temporarily, overpower the drive to destroy. Perhaps the most accessible and universal form of escapism, however, was the simple, ancient act of storytelling. As darkness fell and the fortress settled into an uneasy quiet, people would gather in small groups, families huddled in their chambers, soldiers taking a rare moment of rest in the barracks. Here, storytelling sessions became cherished rituals, especially for the children whose worlds had been so violently shrunk. An elder might recount epic tales from memory, stories of legendary heroes like King Arthur or Charlemagne, whose struggles against impossible odds mirrored their own, but always with a triumphant ending. Others might share folk tales of cunning peasants outwitting greedy lords, or romantic stories of lovers separated by war and then miraculously reunited. These narratives served multiple crucial purposes. For the young, they provided a framework to understand the chaos around them, casting their defenders as heroes in their own epic. For the adults, these stories reinforced shared values, courage, loyalty, perseverance, and offered a narrative of hope where their own story felt stalled and desperate. The act of listening together, of sharing gasps and laughter in the flickering firelight, forged powerful emotional bonds, reinforcing a sense of communal identity that was essential for collective endurance. To dismiss these creative acts as frivolous would be to fundamentally misunderstand their role in the economy of survival. They were as essential as the rationing of grain or the sharpening of swords. While the body was weakened by scarcity, the mind was being fortified by these injections of beauty, narrative, and shared experience. They were psychological tools every bit as important as prayer, providing a necessary counterbalance to the despair that constantly threatened to consume the population. This conscious effort to nurture the inner world, to defiantly celebrate the human capacity for imagination, stood in stark contrast to the brutal, unending physical labor required to keep the fortress itself standing. The same hands that carefully plucked the strings of a lute by night would be calloused and bleeding from hauling stones by day, a powerful duality that defined the besieged experience, a constant dance between sustaining the spirit and maintaining the walls. Yet, for all the mental refuge offered by storytelling and song, the harsh physical reality of the siege demanded an unending, grueling response. The fortress was not a passive shell. It was a living, breathing entity that required constant care and reinforcement to withstand the brutal assaults from without. The romantic image of defenders simply waiting on the battlements is shattered by the Diaries, which paint a picture of relentless, back-breaking labor that consumed every waking hour for nearly every able-bodied person. This was a society transformed into a round-the-clock military workshop, where the survival of the entire community hinged on the strength of their arms and the skill of their hands. The primary task was the maintenance of the stone walls themselves, the very skin of their world. Siege engines like trebuchets and mangonels would pound the fortifications day and night, and each sunrise revealed fresh scars, cracked merlons, crumbling parapets, and breaches that needed immediate attention. Teams of men, often working under the cover of darkness or during lulls in the bombardment, would scramble up scaffolding to make repairs. They used whatever was at hand, fresh-cut timber to shore up a damaged section, baskets of rubble and quick-setting mortar to fill gaps, and even prefabricated wooden hoardings that could be deployed to protect weakened areas. This was dangerous work performed within sight of enemy archers, and the Diaries are filled with grim accounts of laborers struck down by a stray arrow while desperately trying to plug a hole in their defenses. Alongside the masonry work, the air was perpetually filled with the sounds of metal on wood and stone. The fortress's inner courtyards and great halls were converted into bustling, makeshift armories. The most constant sound was the harsh, rhythmic grating of whetstones as soldiers and volunteers alike spent hours sharpening swords, axe heads, and spear points. A dull blade was a liability in the close-quarters combat of a breach, and this monotonous task was a matter of life and death. In other corners, carpenters and fletchers worked feverishly to manufacture a continuous supply of arrows and crossbow bolts. The process was an assembly line of survival, shaping the wooden shafts, attaching carefully crafted metal points, and fletching them with feathers, often plucked from the very poultry that had long since been consumed. The production of these projectiles was a numbers game. A single day of intense fighting could see thousands loosed against the enemy, and stockpiles had to be constantly replenished. The sheer volume of work required meant that traditional roles had to be abandoned. This was perhaps the most striking aspect of siege labor, as described in the journals, the complete mobilization of the entire population. The feudal hierarchy, already strained, broke down entirely under the demands of physical survival. The lord's wife, who would normally oversee a household, might be found organizing a team of women and older children to gather stones from the courtyard to be carried up to the walls for the catapults. Young boys deemed too small to fight were given the critical task of running messages or, more grimly, helping to put out the fires caused by incendiary missiles. These firefighting efforts were a constant battle within the battle. Enemy projectiles dipped in pitch and set ablaze could ignite wooden roofs and structures inside the fortress, threatening to burn the defenders out of their own refuge. Bucket brigades forming human chains from the well to the flames became a common sight, and everyone, regardless of age or status, was expected to take their place in the line. This collective exertion created a powerful, tangible sense of communal purpose. The shared labor, the passing of a heavy stone hand to hand up to the battlements, The collective sigh of relief when a fire was extinguished forged a bond stronger than any social distinction. It was a physical manifestation of their shared fate, a knight sharpening his sword alongside the blacksmith who made it was a potent symbol of their interdependence. However, this unity came at a tremendous physical cost. The work was exhausting, compounding the already severe effects of hunger and fear. Diarists write of people collapsing from sheer fatigue, of hands raw and bleeding from hours of hauling ropes or shaping wood. The relentless labor drained their already depleted energy reserves, leaving them vulnerable to the diseases that stalked the crowded conditions. The constant focus on the walls, on the physical task immediately at hand, served a crucial psychological function. It kept minds occupied, preventing them from dwelling on the larger, more terrifying picture of their predicament. The repetitive, almost meditative action of sharpening a blade or fletching an arrow could provide a temporary respite from existential dread. It was a way to assert control, however small, in a situation defined by a profound lack of it. Yet, even as this collective effort was directed outward, toward the visible enemy, the fate of the fortress often hinged on a much more subtle and dangerous activity happening in the shadows, the desperate attempt to reach beyond the walls and connect with the outside world. While the relentless labor of maintaining the walls focused minds on the immediate physical threat, the psychological survival of the fortress depended on something far more fragile, a connection to the world beyond the encircling enemy. For the inhabitants, the siege was not just a physical prison but an information blackout, a terrifying silence that bred rumors and despair. The desperate need to break this silence gave rise to some of the most daring and ingenious operations of the entire ordeal, a shadow war of communication where the stakes were the very hope of those trapped inside. Diaries from this period reveal that maintaining a link to the outside world was not a secondary concern, but a matter of life and death, pursued with a level of creativity and courage that often matched the military defense itself. The most dramatic figures in this clandestine drama were the messengers. These were not official heralds protected by the rules of war, but ordinary individuals, soldiers, servants, even local farmers who knew the land, who volunteered for missions of incredible peril. Their primary task was to slip through the enemy's lines, a gauntlet of sentries and patrols, to carry pleas for help to any potential allied force. Disguise was their first and most vital tool. A diary from the siege of a castle in the Scottish borders describes how a young page, known for his agility, smeared his face with dirt, dressed in tattered rags, and practiced a convincing limp to pass as a simple, harmless shepherd boy searching for a lost sheep. He carried a sealed message not on parchment, but scratched onto a thin strip of leather that was then rolled and hidden within a hollowed-out crust of stale bread. The success of such a mission hinged on a perfect performance of poverty and insignificance, a nerve-wracking act under the gaze of bored and suspicious soldiers. Other accounts tell of messengers using the cover of darkness or, more dangerously, exploiting periods of heavy rain or fog when visibility was reduced to mere feet. The penalty for failure was swift and brutal. Capture meant almost certain torture and execution, a grim fate detailed in some journals with a chilling matter-of-factness that underscores the constant risk. For those who could not risk a messenger on foot, the very architecture of the fortress sometimes provided a solution: secret tunnels or posterns. These were narrow, hidden passages that burrowed underground, emerging at a discreet location beyond the immediate reach of the besiegers. The existence of such a tunnel was a closely guarded secret, known only to the castle's lord and a few trusted retainers. Using one was a final, desperate gamble. A diary from the lengthy siege of a French stronghold recounts the tense, silent journey of a messenger through a dank, claustrophobic tunnel that exited near a riverbank. The diary describes the agonizing wait as the man was sent out, with no guarantee he would ever reach his destination or that the tunnel's exit hadn't been discovered and watched by the enemy. The days that followed were filled with an almost unbearable suspense as every eye scanned the horizon for a sign, every ear strained for a sound that might signal the return of help or the messenger's capture. The arrival of a returning courier, often bearing a message sealed with the wax seal of a distant ally, was a moment of immense heart-stopping tension for the entire community. Within the walls, a separate but equally vital network of secret communication often flourished, in an environment rife with paranoia, where a careless word could demoralize the garrison or even hint at treachery. The need for discreet coordination was critical. Diaries mention the passing of small, folded notes to maintain morale or convey sensitive instructions. These messages employed clever tricks to avoid detection. The simplest method was to hide a note in a seemingly innocuous object tucked into a loaf of bread being delivered to a specific individual, or slipped under a bowl during meal times. But some methods were far more sophisticated, showcasing a surprising level of ingenuity. Several accounts describe the use of invisible ink, often made from the simple juice of a lemon or an onion. A message could be written between the lines of a normal letter or in the margins of a prayer book, remaining completely invisible until the paper was gently warmed near a candle flame, causing the organic acids in the juice to oxidize and turn brown, revealing the hidden text. This allowed for communication that could bypass casual inspection, a crucial tool for leadership to coordinate without sparking panic. Perhaps one of the most elaborate systems comes from a 15th century diary detailing the siege of a castle that had a distant but clear line of sight to a sympathetic monastery perched on a hill miles away. The defenders established a complex code of lantern signals. From the highest tower of the castle, a trusted guard would use a shielded lantern to send signals, a series of long and short flashes that corresponded to pre-arranged messages. 2 flashes might mean all is well, 3 could signal a successful sortie, while a frantic, continuous flashing would be the ultimate alarm, a plea for immediate help. The monks, in turn, would respond with their own signals, offering news of approaching relief forces or simply messages of spiritual support. This silent, flickering conversation across the darkened landscape was a powerful psychological lifeline. It was a tangible proof to everyone inside that they were not forgotten, that their plight was known, and that the world beyond the enemy camp still existed and was watching. The success or failure of these fragile threads of communication, whether carried by a brave soul on foot or flickered from a tower, could quite literally dictate the fate of every man, woman, and child within the fortress. This desperate, all-consuming need for a connection to the outside world makes the experience of the very youngest inhabitants, the children who watch these dramas unfold with wide, uncomprehending eyes, all the more poignant and tragically human. And in the midst of this high-stakes world of secret messages and desperate labor, there existed a group of inhabitants for whom the siege was not a strategic challenge but a fundamental reshaping of their entire universe, the children. The diaries that survive from older children, or from adults reflecting on their childhood experiences within those walls, offer a perspective that is uniquely heartbreaking in its raw innocence. Their entries present a jarring juxtaposition of the terrifying and the mundane, a world where the brutal reality of their situation collided with the stubborn persistence of childhood. The sound of their laughter as they played tag or rolled hoops across the same courtyards where soldiers drilled created a dissonant echo against the backdrop of shouted orders and the distant thud of trebuchet stones. For these young souls, the fortress was not just a defensive structure, it was the entire scope of their world, its boundaries suddenly and violently defined by the enemy camp just beyond the moat. Their writings are filled with a palpable sense of confusion, an attempt to process a reality that made little sense according to the world they had known. A young boy might write with frustration about why he can no longer go fishing in the river he can see from the ramparts, or a girl might describe her fear of the loud noises that shake her bed at night, wondering if they are the footsteps of giants. One particularly moving account from a teenage girl during the siege of a Welsh castle describes her younger brother's earnest belief that the opposing army's tents were a strange, colorful city that had sprung up overnight for a festival he wasn't allowed to attend. This childlike interpretation, so far from the grim truth, highlights the profound psychological gap between the adult understanding of warfare and a child's struggle to comprehend why their world had become so small, loud, and frightening. They were trying to map this new, terrifying landscape onto the familiar geography of their short lives, and the disconnect was a source of constant, low-grade anxiety. Recognizing this fear, the adults within the fortress often devised small, symbolic tasks for the children, not for any practical necessity, but as a crucial psychological intervention. A knight might solemnly ask a young boy to help polish his helmet before a watch, imparting a sense of importance and inclusion. A little girl might be given the vital duty of caring for the castle's cat or a few cherished chickens, a responsibility that provided a comforting routine and a living creature to nurture amidst the death and destruction. These small acts were a lifeline. They gave children a role in the communal effort, a way to feel less like helpless bystanders and more like participants in their own survival. The simple, repetitive motion of polishing metal to a shine or scattering grain for birds created islands of normalcy and purpose, tiny anchors in a sea of chaos. For a few moments each day, a child could feel proud and useful, their fear momentarily displaced by a sense of accomplishment. Yet, the psychological impact of this confined and violent existence was profound and lasting. A childhood spent under siege was not something one simply outgrew. It etched itself into the very core of a person's identity. Diarists who wrote of their siege experiences later in life often revealed how those years shaped their entire worldview. Some became perpetually cautious, hoarding food or possessions long after the need had passed, a silent testament to the scarcity that had haunted their youth. Others developed a deep-seated distrust of outsiders or a heightened sense of vigilance that never fully abated. Conversely, some developed an incredible resilience and an appreciation for the fragility of peace, having witnessed its opposite firsthand. The fortress walls did not just protect their bodies, they molded their developing minds, creating adults for whom the memory of fear and hunger was a permanent companion. Perhaps the most striking aspect of these youthful accounts is their unintentional wisdom. Unburdened by the complex political motives or military strategies that preoccupied the adults, children observed the human heart of the situation with startling clarity. A child might write with simple sadness about seeing a usually cheerful guardsman crying quietly in a corner, an observation an adult chronicler might have omitted as unimportant. Another might note with childish logic that the enemy soldiers who shouted insults during the day sounded lonely when they sang sad songs at night. These innocent observations cut through the layers of ideology and duty to reveal universal truths about fear, loneliness, and the shared desire for home. They remind us that within every soldier and every servant was a human being capable of suffering, a truth that children, with their unjaded eyes, were often the first to see. This raw, unfiltered perspective on human nature under pressure finds a powerful parallel in the way the siege forced a dramatic re-evaluation of another fundamental social structure, the roles of men and women. The rigid boundaries that normally defined a woman's place in medieval society proved to be shockingly flexible when survival was on the line. The desperate reality of a siege created a crucible where necessity routinely overruled tradition, and the personal journals kept within those walls offer compelling evidence of this dramatic shift. While chronicles of the time might relegate women to the background, these private pages place them squarely at the center of the action, revealing a spectrum of contributions that were absolutely vital to the community's endurance. Far from being passive victims waiting for rescue, women of all stations emerged as dynamic, indispensable agents of their own fate, their roles expanding in ways that would have been unthinkable during peacetime. Consider the scene on the battlements during an assault. While the image of the armored knight is iconic, diaries frequently describe a more diverse line of defenders. With a garrison stretched thin, every able body was needed to repel attackers scaling the walls. Accounts mention women, both noble and common, actively participating in the defense. They are described hurling stones gathered by children over the parapets, pouring boiling water or hot sand down on the enemy, and even assisting in operating siege engines like catapults. One remarkable entry from the siege of a border castle details how the castle's blacksmith's wife, known for her strength and steady nerve, took up a position alongside the archers, using a crossbow with lethal accuracy to pick off enemy soldiers who ventured too close. This was not a symbolic gesture, it was a practical response to an existential threat. Their presence on the walls was a powerful physical manifestation of the fact that the danger was universal, and so too was the responsibility to fight back. Beyond direct combat, women's traditional domestic skills were radically repurposed and became central to the logistical management of the siege. The lady of the castle, in particular, often found her authority transformed and vastly expanded. If her husband, the Lord, was absent leading troops elsewhere, or if he was killed during the fighting, the entire burden of leadership fell upon her shoulders. Her role shifted from managing a household to commanding a community under fire. Diaries reveal these noblewomen making critical decisions about rationing food and water, often with a meticulous eye for fairness that was essential for maintaining morale. They organized the triage and care of the wounded, turning the Great Hall into a hospital and directing servants and volunteers in basic medical care. Their knowledge of herb lore, once used for treating everyday ailments, became crucial for tending to battle injuries and staving off disease. In one well-documented case from the siege of a French stronghold, the castellan's wife personally oversaw the distribution of the last reserves of grain, ensuring that the soldiers on the walls received a slightly larger portion, while also making sure that the children and elderly were not completely forgotten. This exercise of power was not based on martial prowess but on organizational skill, compassion, and a deep understanding of human nature qualities that proved to be just as critical as military strategy. This renegotiation of roles extended far beyond the nobility. Servant women and the wives of craftsmen within the fortress took on immense responsibilities. They were often the ones managing the frantic bucket brigades to put out fires, a constant and deadly threat during a siege. They foraged for every edible weed within the walls, their knowledge of plants becoming a key asset in the fight against starvation. They repaired clothing and armor, and their work in the kitchen stretching meager supplies into something resembling a meal was a daily act of defiance against despair. The diaries of these women, though rare, speak less of dramatic heroism and more of relentless, grinding perseverance. Their contributions were the foundation upon which the entire defense rested. Without their labor in maintaining the basic functions of life, the soldiers on the walls would have quickly succumbed to hunger, sickness, and demoralization. These first-hand accounts fundamentally challenge the stereotypical image of the helpless medieval woman cowering in a tower. They reveal a much more complex and accurate picture, that of active, resilient participants who adapted to extreme circumstances with courage and ingenuity. The siege did not suspend the feudal hierarchy, but it created a parallel hierarchy based on competence and contribution, where a woman's value was measured by her actions rather than her birth. This collective effort, where every individual's skill was harnessed for the common good, was the true key to resilience. Yet, this hard-won unity was incredibly fragile. The very closeness that fostered cooperation also bred a climate of intense suspicion, where the fear of a hidden enemy within could unravel the trust that held the community together. This atmosphere of intense suspicion, where a misplaced word or a furtive glance could be misinterpreted, created a social poison that seeped into every interaction. The fortress, designed to keep enemies out, became a cage that amplified every whisper and fueled every paranoid thought. Diarists from the siege of a castle in the Loire Valley describe how a simple, innocent conversation between a guard and a servant from a nearby village, a village now occupied by the enemy, could spark a wildfire of rumor. Was he gathering information? Was she signaling to someone outside? In a community where everyone knew each other's business, the most mundane activities were suddenly re-evaluated through a lens of potential betrayal. The friendly baker who gave an extra crust to a child might be accused of trying to gain favor before a planned treachery. The soldier who advocated for a cautious defense might be labeled a coward or, worse, a secret sympathizer with the besiegers. This constant, low-grade anxiety forced people to become actors in their own home, carefully monitoring their speech and expressions, their faces becoming masks that hid their true fears and frustrations. The emotional energy required to maintain this facade was immense, draining reserves of strength that were already depleted by hunger and fatigue. The need to root out perceived threats led to the emergence of informal and often terrifying systems of justice. While the lord or castellan held formal authority, the pressure from a paranoid populace could force their hand. Diaries recount the formation of secret tribunals, where a small group of trusted individuals would convene in a secluded chamber to hear accusations against a fellow inhabitant. The evidence presented was often flimsy at best, a reported midnight stroll in the wrong part of the courtyard, a vague resemblance to a known enemy sympathizer, or simply the word of a single, perhaps malicious, accuser. The accused faced an almost impossible task of proving a negative, of demonstrating their innocence in the absence of any concrete proof of guilt. One particularly harrowing account from a siege in the 14th century tells of a stable hand who was accused of planning to poison the horses after several animals fell ill. The illness was likely due to contaminated feed, but in the heated atmosphere, the man's foreign accent and his habit of keeping to himself were enough to condemn him. His diary entry, written in a desperate, shaky hand the night before his execution, is a heartbreaking plea to a god he felt had abandoned him, a testament to the tragic human cost of this internal witch hunt. The consequences of being branded a traitor were swift and brutal, designed to serve as a grim warning to others. Public punishment was a spectacle intended to reinforce communal solidarity by purging the perceived source of corruption. Accounts describe individuals being thrown into the castle dungeons to await a fate often considered worse than death on the battlefield. Some were executed, their deaths serving as a bloody lesson in loyalty. Others might be subjected to torture in a desperate attempt to extract a confession or names of accomplices, a process that only deepened the climate of fear. The diary of a chaplain from this era describes his agonizing duty of offering last rites to a man he believed was innocent, a man broken by pain and fear, forced to confess to crimes he did not commit simply to end his suffering. These events cast a long shadow over the community. While they might temporarily satisfy the mob's desire for a scapegoat, they also sowed deeper seeds of distrust. If an innocent person could be condemned, then no one was truly safe. The bonds of trust, so painstakingly built through shared labor and suffering, could be shattered in an instant by a baseless accusation. This internal state of siege, this war of nerves fought within their own ranks, imposed a psychological burden that was in some ways more insidious than the external threat. An enemy outside the walls was a known quantity. You could see them, you could fight them, but an enemy within was a phantom, invisible and omnipresent. This constant vigilance, this need to doubt one's neighbors and even one's own judgment, created a form of mental exhaustion that could be just as debilitating as physical starvation. Diarists write of lying awake at night, not from the noise of the enemy, but from the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside their door, wondering about the intentions of the person walking past. They describe the strain of maintaining a cheerful demeanor when their hearts were filled with suspicion, of offering a reassuring smile to someone they secretly feared. This emotional discipline, this careful management of outward appearance to preserve inward safety, was a draining and lonely battle. It forced each individual into a state of isolation even amidst the crowded conditions of the fortress, a silent struggle that would leave its own deep scars long after the physical siege had ended. Cut off from the familiar rhythms of the world, the arrival of merchants, the pilgrimage of saints, the planting and harvest of fields, those trapped inside a fortress developed a new and profound relationship with time itself. The steady, predictable march of days and seasons, which had once been the comforting backdrop to their lives, was warped by the siege into something altogether different, a slow, grinding meter for their suffering. Without the ability to mark time through travel or commerce, the inhabitants turned inward, becoming hyper-aware of its passage within their confined universe. Diarists from this period reveal a near-universal obsession with tracking the days, a practice that was as much about maintaining sanity as it was about keeping a record. Some resorted to the physical, carving a simple notch into a stone wall each morning with a knife, creating a stark, visual calendar of their entrapment. Others, with access to ink and parchment, maintained meticulous daily logs, their entries often beginning with the same formulaic phrase, "the 15th day of the siege," or "on the feast of Saint Michael, which we could not celebrate." These notations were acts of defiance, a way to impose a linear order on an experience that otherwise felt like a formless, endless nightmare. The liturgical calendar, which had structured the entire year around festivals, fasts, and holy days, now became a source of profound melancholy. A diary from the siege of a castle in Normandy poignantly describes the arrival of Easter. In a normal year, this would have been a time of joyous celebration, marked by a special mass, a feast after the Lenten fast, and perhaps even music and dancing in the courtyard. But during the siege, the day passed like any other. The diarist writes of hearing the priest say a quiet, hurried mass in the chapel, the congregation thin and somber. There was no feast. Instead, the daily ration of thin porridge was distributed as usual. The absence of celebration was a painful reminder of everything they had lost, not just food and freedom, but the very rituals that gave their lives meaning and connected them to a wider Christian community. Each missed feast day deepened their sense of isolation, reinforcing the grim reality that they were alone in their ordeal, forgotten by the world outside. This internal marking of time was mirrored by the changes they could observe from their limited vantage points high on the battlements. The world beyond their walls was now a forbidden spectacle, a painting they could look at but never enter. And so they watched the seasons turn with an intensity born of desperation. The first snowfall of winter, which might have once been a welcome sight promising a different kind of beauty, was now a portent of increased misery, signaling the arrival of bitter cold and the certain death of any hope for a quick relief force until the spring thaw. Conversely, the sight of the first green buds on a solitary tree struggling to grow in the inner courtyard could spark a disproportionate surge of hope. That tiny gesture of life persisting within their stone prison felt like a personal message of resilience. It was a sign that the earth was still turning, that life was renewing itself, and that perhaps their deliverance might come with the new season. A diarist from a lengthy siege in Italy describes the heart-wrenching sight of a cherry tree in full bloom just beyond the range of enemy archers. Its fragile pink blossoms, so vibrant and full of life, stood in stark contrast to the grey stone and the grim faces of the guards, becoming a symbol of the beautiful, unreachable world they were fighting to rejoin. This created a peculiar and taxing psychological state. On one hand, the days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of hunger, fear, and labor that made time feel stagnant. One sunrise was indistinguishable from the last, each bringing the same challenges and the same fears. Yet, paradoxically, each new dawn was also a milestone, a small victory in itself. Surviving another day was an achievement. This duality, the blurring of time alongside the heightened significance of each passing day, placed the besieged in a kind of temporal limbo. They were living in a prolonged present, haunted by memories of the past and taunted by uncertain hopes for the future. Their internal emotional clockwork became inextricably linked to the external rhythm of the siege. A period of quiet from the enemy lines might allow a fragile optimism to bloom, a sense that perhaps the besiegers were growing weary or that a negotiation was underway. Then, the sudden resumption of a catapult barrage or a nighttime assault would shatter that illusion, plunging the entire community back into a heightened state of alert and resetting their collective sense of time back to zero. The constant, unpredictable noise of the siege outside became the drumbeat to which this internal drama of hope and despair was set, an auditory landscape that was as much a weapon as any sword or arrow. If the unending labor on the walls defined the physical rhythm of siege life, the soundscape that enveloped the fortress defined its psychological atmosphere. The Diaries open a window onto an auditory hell, a relentless cacophony that was as meticulously engineered as any battering ram or siege tower. This was not merely the byproduct of conflict, it was a deliberate and calculated form of psychological warfare, a constant auditory assault designed to grind down the nerves of everyone trapped inside. From the first light of dawn to the deepest hours of the night, the air was never still. It was filled with a horrifying symphony of violence that left no room for peace of mind. The most dominant sound was the deep, earth-shaking thunder of trebuchets and mangonels, a percussive boom that echoed across the landscape and vibrated through the very stone beneath the defenders' feet. This was followed by the unnerving whistle of an incoming projectile, a high-pitched scream that grew in intensity until it ended in a deafening crash of splintering wood and shattering stone. The Diaries describe how people would flinch involuntarily at this sound, their bodies tensing in anticipation of the impact, a physical reaction that repeated itself hundreds of times a day, etching a deep groove of anxiety into their souls. But the mechanical sounds of warfare were only part of the torment. Interwoven with them were the human sounds, which were often far more disturbing. From beyond the walls came the shouts and taunts of the enemy soldiers, their voices carrying clearly on the wind. They would jeer at the defenders, questioning their courage, mocking their lord, and making crude promises about the fate that awaited their women and children. Some diarists wrote of besiegers holding mock tournaments just out of arrow range, their laughter and cheers a cruel parody of normal life, a reminder of the festive world from which the fortress was excluded. Even more harrowing were the sounds that originated from within their own ranks, the agonized moans of the wounded being carried from the battlements, the desperate cries for water from those dying of fever in the infirmary, and the solemn chanting of priests administering last rites. This created a horrifying stereo effect where the threat from outside was amplified by the evidence of suffering inside, making the entire fortress feel like a resonating chamber of despair. Paradoxically, it was often the sudden absence of sound that proved most terrifying. After days or weeks of relentless noise, a sudden, unexpected silence would fall over the enemy camp. The trebuchets would stop their pounding, the shouts and drumming would cease. This silence was not a relief, it was profoundly ominous. In the void left by the cacophony, every small sound within the fortress, the scuffle of a rat, the cough of a child, the creak of a door became magnified and unnerving. This quiet was universally interpreted as a sign that the besiegers were preparing something new and terrible. Perhaps they were mining under the walls, their silence masking the sound of digging. Maybe they were assembling their forces for a night assault, using the darkness and quiet as their ally. Diarists describe these silences as periods of excruciating tension, where the defenders would strain their ears, their imaginations conjuring up horrors far worse than the known threat of the noise. The inability to sleep during these quiet periods, their bodies still buzzing with adrenaline, was a special kind of torture. The besiegers were masterful psychologists, and they understood the power of this auditory manipulation perfectly. They weaponized sound with chilling creativity. Historical accounts and diaries describe how armies would employ musicians not for morale, but for malice. These musicians would play insulting songs specifically composed to ridicule the defending lord or to mock the plight of those inside. They might play cheerful, celebratory music during a particularly harsh bombardment, adding a layer of psychological insult to the physical injury. A common and particularly cruel tactic was the simulated night attack. Just as the exhausted defenders were settling into a fitful sleep, the enemy camp would erupt with the sudden blare of trumpets, the beating of drums, and the shouts of men. The garrison would be roused to full alert, scrambling to the walls with their weapons, hearts pounding, only to find the field below empty. The attackers had no intention of assaulting. Their goal was simply to rob the defenders of rest, to fray their nerves further, and to create an environment of such sustained uncertainty that the will to resist would eventually crumble. This auditory siege was a battle for the mind, and it was often just as decisive as the one fought with steel. Yet, amidst this relentless auditory assault and the corrosive atmosphere of suspicion, the human spirit displayed a breathtaking capacity to find and create islands of profound beauty and connection. These were not grand, dramatic events, but rather fleeting, almost stolen moments that shine with an intense light from the pages of the diaries, precisely because of the overwhelming darkness that surrounded them. They reveal that even when reduced to the most basic struggle for survival, people clung fiercely to the small, tender gestures that affirmed their shared humanity. A common soldier, his own stomach aching with hunger, writes of finding a single, withered apple that had rolled into a corner of the storeroom, forgotten by those who had cleared it out. Instead of eating it himself, he sought out the youngest child in the fortress, a little girl who had been listless and quiet for days. He describes the way her eyes widened, the faint smile that touched her lips as she took the fruit, and how that simple, unspoken exchange, the gift of a morsel of food, filled him with a sense of purpose that hours of fighting on the walls could not. It was a momentary restoration of his own faith, not in God or victory, but in the fundamental goodness that could still exist between people. These moments of beauty often came from an unexpected appreciation of the natural world, observed from their confined vantage point. A noblewoman, her mind burdened with the logistics of rationing and the fear of an impending assault, writes of pausing on the ramparts at dusk. She describes the sunset in meticulous, almost reverent detail, the way the clouds caught the fire of the sinking sun, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold that were entirely untouched by the grimy reality of the conflict below. For a few minutes, the world was silent, and the sheer, indifferent beauty of the spectacle offered a form of solace. It was a reminder that the universe was vast, and their desperate struggle, while all-consuming to them, was just a small drama playing out beneath an immense and timeless sky. This perspective was not a dismissal of their suffering, but a necessary mental escape, a way to briefly transcend their immediate circumstances and touch something eternal and peaceful. The diaries are filled with these small, vital sparks of normalcy, a shared joke between two guards during a tense night watch, a burst of laughter that felt both forbidden and healing. A group of women singing a familiar folk song together as they worked, their voices harmonizing in the dim light of a courtyard, creating a pocket of shared culture and comfort. A quiet prayer offered not in the formal setting of the chapel, but between two friends huddled in a doorway, their words a private plea for strength. In a world defined by scarcity, these acts of generosity, these acknowledgements of beauty, and these expressions of camaraderie became a different kind of currency, the emotional sustenance that was as critical to survival as bread or water. They were proof that life, in its most essential sense, had not been extinguished. The will to find joy, to offer comfort, to appreciate beauty, these were the ultimate acts of defiance against the forces that sought to reduce them to mere animals fighting for survival. These glimpses of light were crucial for mental survival, yet they existed in a constant, grim balance with the stark realities of their situation. The same diary entry that describes a beautiful sunset might immediately turn to the somber task of tallying the dead from the previous day's skirmish. The laughter shared over a joke would inevitably be cut short by the sound of a distant cry of pain. This juxtaposition is what makes these accounts so powerful and so human. The defenders were not stoic heroes untouched by fear or despair. They were ordinary people navigating an extraordinary nightmare, grabbing onto moments of grace wherever they could find them, even as they were forced to confront the most harrowing aspects of their existence. The emotional resilience to appreciate a sunset while living amidst death was a testament to the complexity of the human spirit, a spirit that now had to face the logistical and emotional horror of dealing with those who had not survived the ordeal. The stench was the first thing you could not escape. In the crowded confines of a fortress under siege, the sweet, cloying odor of death began to permeate everything. The stone walls, the clothing, the very air people breathed. It was a constant, grim reminder of the stakes, an olfactory assault that added a profound layer of psychological horror to the physical dangers of the siege. The logistical and emotional challenge of handling the deceased becomes one of the most starkly practical and haunting themes in the diaries from this period. With the churchyards and consecrated ground lying beyond the walls, now firmly in enemy-controlled territory, the community was cut off from the traditional and deeply necessary rituals of burial. There was no way to grant their fallen comrades, friends, and family members a proper, dignified farewell according to the customs of their faith. This denial of last rites was a spiritual injury inflicted upon the living as much as the dead, a cruel addition to their suffering. The solutions they were forced to adopt were as grim as the problem itself. Within the cramped inner courtyards or baileys, large pits would be dug to serve as mass graves. These were not the orderly rows of a cemetery, but hurried, utilitarian trenches. Diarists describe the somber, silent process of these burials, which often had to be conducted under the cover of darkness to avoid attracting the attention of enemy archers. There was no time for individual coffins or even shrouds for most. Bodies were often interred together, wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared, their identities recorded, if at all, only in the memory of the priest or a quick scratch on a piece of wood. In some castles, the existing crypts beneath the chapel were pressed into service, their cold, dark chambers becoming the final resting place for a rapidly growing number of occupants. The diaries speak of the hollow, echoing sound of dirt hitting stone in those underground vaults, a sound that seemed to suck the hope from the air. Living in such intimate and prolonged proximity to the dead had a corrosive effect on morale. The presence of these makeshift graves in the very courtyards where children had recently played, or where people gathered to draw water from the well, was a relentless memento mori. You could not walk from your quarters to the walls without passing the spot where your friends lay. The psychological difficulty was immense. It forced a constant, unwelcome confrontation with mortality, blurring the line between the world of the living and the dead. The fear of disease, already a pervasive terror, was compounded by the knowledge that decomposition was happening just feet below the surface. This was not the abstract concept of death in battle. It was the immediate, tangible, and smelly reality of corpses festering within the community's heart. Out of a profound need for respect and a desperate attempt to cling to some semblance of humanity, some garrisons undertook incredibly dangerous missions. Diaries from a few sieges mention clandestine attempts to smuggle the bodies of the most prominent fallen, a beloved knight, the Lord's own son, out of the fortress under the cover of the blackest night. This was a mission of immense risk, requiring a small team to lower a heavy, wrapped body over the walls using ropes, and then carry it through the enemy's picket lines to find a patch of unconsecrated but free earth for a secret, hurried burial. The motivation was not strategic but deeply human. A final act of devotion, a refusal to let a hero's remains be treated with the same grim anonymity as the rest. The success of such a mission provided a small, bittersweet victory for the soul, even as it highlighted the utter desperation of their circumstances. This grim duty of caring for the dead, of living alongside them, became one of the heaviest burdens carried by the besieged. It was a constant, oppressive reminder of the ultimate cost of their resistance. Every body that was lowered into the cold ground was a testament to failure, a life lost in defense of the walls. Yet, in a paradox that defines the siege experience, this intimate daily acquaintance with death could also fuel a fierce and desperate desire to fight back, to make the enemy pay a price for every life they had cost. The same hands that had tenderly closed the eyes of a friend in the morning might by afternoon be gripping a weapon with white-knuckled intensity, a burning need for retaliation mixing with the grief. This simmering combination of sorrow and rage, born from the grim reality of the graveyard within their home, would sometimes boil over into the most audacious and dangerous actions a garrison could take. Not merely defending their walls, but launching a furious, desperate attack against the very army that held them trapped. But to view the defenders as purely reactive, simply waiting behind their walls for the next blow to fall, is to misunderstand the fierce, defiant spirit that animated many a besieged garrison. The diaries shatter this image of passive victimhood, revealing a much more dynamic and aggressive reality. Far from cowering in fear, garrisons frequently seized the initiative through daring surprise attacks known as sallies. These were not acts of desperation, but calculated, high-risk operations launched from a position of seeming weakness against an enemy that often felt secure in its overwhelming strength. Primary objectives were brutally practical: to cripple the besiegers' ability to wage war. A small, highly motivated force would target the great siege engines, the trebuchets and mangonels that were slowly pounding the walls to dust. Using fire and axes, they would attempt to reduce these complex wooden structures to ash and splinters. Equally valuable targets were the supply depots, the sprawling camps of tents and wagons that housed the food, arrows, and spare parts keeping the enemy army in the field. A single successful raid could torch weeks' worth of provisions, sowing discord and hunger in the enemy ranks and potentially shortening the entire siege. The first-hand accounts from soldiers who participated in these sorties are some of the most vivid and adrenaline-fueled passages in all of siege literature. They describe the tense preparations under cover of darkness, blackening their faces with soot, muffling their armor with cloth to prevent any telltale clinking, and checking and rechecking their weapons. The moment of exit was always the most perilous. This was not a heroic charge through the main gates, but a furtive, dangerous process. Men would often clamber over the walls using ropes or slip out through a small, hidden postern gate, their hearts pounding as they moved silently into the no-man's land between safety and the enemy camp. One diary from a man at arms during the siege of a coastal fortress describes the agonizingly slow crawl across open ground, every twig snap sounding like a thunderclap in the stillness, the only light coming from the enemy's own watchfires. The transition from stealth to violence was sudden and total. Once they were discovered, the mission became a whirlwind of chaos and brutality. The diaries speak of the disorienting confusion of close-quarters combat in the dark, the brief, fierce struggles around a siege tower, the feel of an axe biting into dry timber, and the exhilarating sight of flames beginning to lick hungrily at a valuable supply wagon. The return journey was often just as dangerous as the attack itself. With the enemy now fully alerted and enraged, the defenders would race back toward their walls, often carrying wounded comrades or dragging sacks of captured food, while arrows and crossbow bolts whistled past them from the pursuing enemy. The Diary of a Knight involved in a sally from a castle in Gascony describes the heart-stopping moment of the return, the desperate sprint for the safety of the postern gate as it was held open just wide enough for them to squeeze through one by one, the portcullis slamming down behind the last man with a definitive crash that separated them from certain death. The feeling upon a successful return was not just relief, but a surge of collective euphoria that would ripple through the entire fortress. A successful sally was a tremendous psychological victory, perhaps the most important kind. It demonstrated to everyone inside, from the highest lord to the lowliest servant, that they were not just prey to be hunted, but active, dangerous agents in their own fate. It was a powerful rebuttal to the creeping despair that constant bombardment and hunger could foster, replacing it with a fierce, hard-won pride. Yet, for all its potential rewards, the decision to launch a sally was one of the most difficult calculations a garrison commander could make. It was a high-stakes gamble where the price of failure was catastrophically high. The men sent on these missions were often the fittest and most skilled warriors in the fortress, the very individuals most critical to its defense. The loss of even a handful of these key fighters in a botched sortie could cripple the garrison's ability to hold the walls during a major assault. Furthermore, a failed sally could have devastating consequences for morale. To see their best men cut down or captured just outside the walls was a demoralizing spectacle that could shatter the community's spirit far more effectively than any siege engine. And the enemy's response to such an attack was often swift and brutal. A stung besieging army might launch an immediate, furious assault in retaliation, or they might subject the fortress to an intensified bombardment, or even execute prisoners in a grim warning against further defiance. The commander had to weigh the potential boost to morale and the material damage they could inflict against the very real possibility of provoking a final, overwhelming storm that the weakened garrison might not survive. This complex strategic dance, this constant weighing of risk and reward, was a testament to the sophisticated military thinking happening within the besieged mind, a mindset that was also constantly probing for another, less bloody path to survival through the delicate and equally dangerous art of negotiation. Yet, even as the defiant spirit of the sally faded and the gates were barred once more, another, more subtle form of combat often began. The clang of swords would be replaced by the careful, measured words of diplomacy as periods of truce and negotiation descended upon the besieged fortress. These pauses in the fighting, rather than bringing relief, introduced a new and uniquely agonizing form of suspense. The diaries from these interludes reveal a profound shift in the atmosphere within the walls. The constant, adrenaline-fueled fear of immediate violence was replaced by a slow-burning, cerebral anxiety. The world seemed to hold its breath, and in that silence, hope and dread waged their own quiet war in the heart of every inhabitant. The primary actors in this drama were the envoys, often chosen from among the clergy or lower-ranking nobles for their eloquence and their perceived neutrality. Watching these figures, draped in signs of truce like a white flag or a cross, walk calmly out of the gate and into the lion's den of the enemy camp was a surreal spectacle. They carried with them not just scrolls of terms, but the collective, breathless hopes of everyone inside. Their return, hours or even days later, was a moment of unbearable tension. The entire population would watch from the walls, searching the envoy's face and posture for any clue. A slight slump of the shoulders, a hurried step, a neutral expression that might betray the outcome of the talks. Within the fortress, this diplomatic limbo became a fertile ground for rumor and speculation, a psychological plague that could be as damaging as any sickness. Cut off from the actual discussions, people were left to piece together fragments of information and their own deepest fears. The castle keep and courtyards would hum with whispered conversations. A servant who had overheard a fragment of the Lord's council might spread a story that generous terms were being offered. A soldier who had seen the enemy commander laughing might interpret it as a sign of contempt and impending betrayal. Each person, from the highest lady to the lowliest stable hand, crafted their own narrative of the negotiations, a story tailored to their own capacity for optimism or pessimism. A diary from the siege of a castle in Aquitaine captures this perfectly, describing how two guards on the same stretch of wall could hold completely opposing views. ONE Chinese letter, convinced that a relief army was just days away and the enemy was offering surrender terms out of weakness, while his companion was equally certain that the talks were a ruse to lull them into a false sense of security. A final, brutal assault. This division of hope fractured the hard-won unity of the garrison, replacing shared purpose with individual anxiety. The central, terrifying question hanging over every negotiation was the nature of the surrender terms. This was not an abstract concern. It was a matter of life and death on a massive scale. The laws and customs of medieval warfare offered a spectrum of possibilities, and the fate of the entire community hinged on where their surrender would land. On one end was the hope for honorable terms. This could mean being granted the right of departure or free passage, where the garrison would be allowed to march out of the fortress with their weapons, their personal banners flying, and proceed to a friendly territory. This was the best possible outcome, a preservation of life and honor, but there was a far darker alternative. If the garrison was deemed to have resisted too long, or if the besieging commander was particularly vengeful, they might be offered terms of unconditional surrender or at the mercy of the victor. This phrase, "at the mercy," was one of the most terrifying in the medieval lexicon. It could mean anything from enslavement to summary execution. The fear of a massacre following a surrender was a powerful deterrent, often compelling garrisons to fight to the last man rather than risk the wholesale slaughter of the soldiers and the civilians sheltering within. The diaries are filled with anguished debates about trust. Could the enemy commander's word be relied upon? History was littered with examples of truces broken and promises shattered. To accept terms was to place the lives of every soul in the fortress into the hands of the very person who had been trying to kill them for months. This diplomatic dance was therefore a high-stakes battle of wits and wills between the opposing leaders, a psychological duel fought with promises and threats instead of blades. The besieged commander had to project an air of unwavering resolve, even if his supplies were nearly gone and his men were on the brink of collapse. To show desperation was to invite predatory terms. He might deliberately stage displays of defiance during the truce, having his men cheer on the walls, or ostentatiously carrying sacks of what looked like grain but might only be sand, to create the illusion of strength. The besieging commander, in turn, had to balance the desire for a quick victory with the cost of a final assault. He might offer lenient terms initially, hoping to avoid the casualties of storming the walls, but he also had to demonstrate his resolve, perhaps by staging a mock preparation for an attack to pressure the defenders. The back and forth of offers and counteroffers was a delicate game of chess where every move was scrutinized for hidden meaning. For those trapped inside, these pauses were a special kind of torment. The temporary silence from the enemy camp was not peaceful, it was heavy with implication. The lack of action made the waiting worse as minds raced to imagine every possible outcome, each more terrifying than the last. The suspension of violence did not bring peace, but rather a transfer of the conflict from the physical realm to the psychological, a tense and exhausting prelude to the final, violent crescendo that would ultimately decide their fate. And then the world dissolved into noise and chaos. The final assault, the moment every diary had been leading towards, was not a single event but a violent cascade of failures. It might begin with a section of the wall weakened by weeks of bombardment, finally giving way with a groan of shifting stone and a cloud of blinding dust. Or perhaps the main gate, battered by a ram, would splinter inward, revealing a tide of armored men shouting their battle cries. The diaries from this precise moment are physically different from all that came before. The handwriting becomes a frantic scrawl, the ink blotted and smeared, the sentences fragmented as if the author's hand could barely keep pace with the horror unfolding around them. These are not composed reflections, they are raw transcripts of terror, written in real time or hastily scribbled during a fleeting lull, each word a desperate attempt to bear witness to the end. The sensory overload described is overwhelming. A diarist from the fall of a castle in Normandy writes of the deafening crescendo of sound, the roar of the collapsing masonry, the shrieks of the wounded, the metallic clash of weapons, and the guttural shouts of men fighting for their lives, all merging into a single, terrifying roar that echoed through the stone corridors. But it is the small, intimate details that often strike the deepest chord. Another account describes the sight of rain beginning to fall, mixing with the blood on the cobblestones of the inner courtyard, creating pinkish rivulets that swirled around the bodies of the fallen. A soldier writing from a barricaded stairwell notes the incongruous smell of baking bread from the kitchens, a final, futile attempt to feed the defenders, its wholesome aroma a bizarre counterpoint to the stench of sweat, iron, and smoke. These juxtapositions heighten the surreal nightmare of the experience, where the familiar world collides violently with the apocalypse. the nature of the battle changes dramatically once the outer defenses are breached. The fight is no longer a long-range exchange of arrows and stones. It becomes a series of brutal, close-quarter struggles in the most confined spaces of the fortress. Diarists recount the desperate last stands at choke points, a handful of men holding a narrow spiral staircase, forcing the attackers to come at them one by one. A final rally in the Great Hall, using overturned tables and benches as a makeshift barricade. A fight to the death in the chapel itself, the sacred space desecrated by violence. These accounts are unflinching in their portrayal of human behavior under extreme stress. They speak of incredible heroism, a knight who sacrifices himself to hold a door, allowing women and children to flee to the relative safety of the keep. But they also record moments of sheer panic and cowardice, of men breaking ranks and running or hiding in cellars, their will to live overriding their sense of duty. There is no single narrative of noble sacrifice. Instead, the diaries present a messy, human tapestry of courage and fear, often existing side by side in the same individual. Amidst the fury, there are moments of profound stillness and resignation. Many entries describe individuals knowing the end is near, simply stopping. A defender might lean against a wall, too exhausted to lift his sword, waiting passively for whatever comes. Others gather for one last, hurried prayer, their voices barely a whisper against the din. A lady's diary from a famous siege describes seeing the castle's priest, his vestments torn, calmly administering the last rites to dying men in the midst of the fighting, an island of sacramental peace in a sea of chaos. For some, particularly those who had endured months of starvation and fear, the final assault brought a strange, almost welcome sense of relief. The long, agonizing suspense was finally over. The dice had been cast. The outcome, whether life or death, was at least decided. This resignation is not a lack of feeling, but rather the exhaustion of all feeling, the final surrender to a fate that could no longer be resisted. These eyewitness accounts are priceless to historians because they provide the granular, minute-by-minute details that official chronicles omit. While a king's report might simply state, "The castle fell on the feast of St. Giles," a diary tells us how it fell. It names the men who fought at the breach. It describes the exact point where the wall collapsed. It captures the last words of a dying friend. They transform a historical event from a dry fact into a visceral human experience. The final pages of these journals are often the most difficult to read. Some end abruptly, mid-sentence, a silence more eloquent than any words. Others conclude with a simple, stark notation of capture, leaving the reader to imagine the fate that awaited the author. But a few manage a final, reflective thought. One such diary from a clerk who survived the fall of his fortress ends with a line that echoes across the centuries. He writes, "The noise has stopped. The only sound now is the weeping, and so ends our long defiance. The battle was over, but for those who survived the final storm, a new and uncertain chapter of suffering was just beginning." But the final assault, for all its terrifying finality, was not always the end of the story. For the survivors, the moment the fighting stopped marked the beginning of a new and profoundly uncertain chapter. A harsh reality that many diarists continued to document even after their fortress had fallen. The experience of surrender and its immediate aftermath was not a single, uniform fate but a spectrum of outcomes dictated by the customs of war, the whims of the victor, and the social status of the captive. For the lucky few, particularly high-ranking nobles or knights from wealthy families, there was the possibility of ransom. This was a cold, commercial transaction where a prisoner's life was assigned a monetary value. A captured lord might be treated with a degree of courtesy, housed in relatively comfortable quarters while messengers were dispatched to his family to negotiate a price for his freedom. The Diary of a Knight captured at the fall of a castle in Aquitaine describes the strange limbo of this period. The relief at being alive mixed with the anxiety of whether his family could raise the exorbitant sum demanded, and the shame of his capture. For these individuals, survival came at the cost of a financial burden that could cripple their estates for a generation. For the vast majority of defenders, however, the future was far grimmer. Common soldiers, archers, and men-at-arms who were not worth a ransom faced the bleak prospect of indefinite imprisonment. They might be thrown into the dank, overcrowded dungeons of the victor's own castle, or marched in chains to a more distant prison. Their diaries, if they manage to keep them, speak of a new kind of confinement, often more squalid and hopeless than the siege itself. The fate of the civilian population, the women, children, craftsmen, and servants who had been trapped inside, was even more precarious. They were often considered the spoils of war. Women of noble birth could be held for ransom alongside the men, but they also faced the terrifying threat of forced marriage to solidify the victor's political control, or simply being taken as concubines. Common women and children could be dispersed as servants or slaves, their lives and families shattered in an instant. The most tragic accounts come from those who witnessed the brutal reprisals that sometimes followed a particularly stubborn defense. A garrison that had held out for months, inflicting heavy casualties on the besiegers, could enrage the victorious commander. In these cases, the laws of war, which offered some protection to those who surrendered, could be ignored. Diarists write of mass executions, of soldiers being put to the sword in the very courtyards they had defended, a final, bloody act of vengeance for the trouble they had caused. Beyond the immediate terror of capture or death, the survivors faced a profound psychological shock when they finally stepped outside the walls that had been their entire world for so long. After months of living within a confined, albeit terrifyingly familiar, space, the sudden openness of the landscape was physically disorienting. A diarist from the siege of a Welsh stronghold describes the overwhelming sensation of walking through the breached gate. He writes of the horizon seeming impossibly distant, the sky unnervingly vast after being accustomed to the narrow rectangle visible from the inner ward. The air itself felt different, carrying unfamiliar smells from the surrounding countryside, a stark contrast to the constant odors of smoke, sickness, and confinement within the fortress. But this newfound freedom was an illusion. The world they re-entered was often a scarred and devastated version of the one they had left. The once familiar fields and villages surrounding the castle were now a wasteland, systematically stripped by the besieging army for supplies and firewood. Orchards were cut down, crops were burned, and the landscape was littered with the debris of the encampment, abandoned siege engines, latrine pits, and the graves of those who had died in the fighting. The home they had fought so desperately to protect was gone, replaced by a grim monument to the conflict. For those who had endured a siege of many months or even years, this re-entry into the world was uniquely disorienting. The world had not stood still while they were trapped. News that filtered through during the siege was often outdated or incomplete. A diarist might step outside to discover that the political landscape had shifted entirely, that their liege lord had been killed in a distant battle, that a truce had been signed, or that the very cause for which they had suffered had become irrelevant. The psychological whiplash was immense. The sacrifices made within the walls, the friends lost to hunger or enemy arrows, the months of terror and deprivation could suddenly feel pointless, their heroic stand reduced to a minor footnote in a larger conflict that had moved on without them. This sense of temporal dislocation, of returning to a world that no longer had a place for them, is a powerful theme in these final entries. They were ghosts from a recent but already forgotten past, carrying with them memories of an ordeal that no one on the outside could truly comprehend. It is in these concluding reflections that the diaries achieve their deepest resonance. The authors, having survived the physical trial, now begin the much longer and more difficult process of grappling with its meaning. Their entries become less about recording daily events and more about making sense of the trauma. They write long, poignant lists of the friends and family members they have lost, not as a mere inventory, but as an act of remembrance, a desperate attempt to ensure that these lives are not erased by the finality of defeat. They question their own actions, wrestling with guilt over decisions made under duress. Could a different rationing strategy have saved more children? Should they have sallied out more often? Was surrender considered too early or too late? This introspection is the beginning of a long, internal healing process. The physical wounds might eventually mend, but the psychological scars, what we would now recognize as the hallmarks of profound trauma, would remain. The sound of a slamming door could trigger a panic attack. A sudden hunger pang could bring back the visceral memory of starvation, and the sight of a distant fire on the horizon could send a chill of terror down their spines for the rest of their lives. These final pages are not just historical records, they are some of the earliest documented accounts of living with post-traumatic stress, a testament to the enduring cost of survival. This deeply personal process of making sense of their suffering, of finding a way to carry the weight of their memories, is what ultimately connects their individual stories to the broader, timeless human experience of resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. But after immersing ourselves in these powerful personal stories, we must pause for a moment of critical reflection. We have been leaning heavily on these diary entries, treating them as our direct line to the past, and it's absolutely vital that we now consider the nature of that connection. What are we actually holding in our hands when we read these fragile pages? The answer is both wonderfully simple and deeply complex. These diaries are not transparent windows offering a perfect, objective view of history. They are instead beautifully flawed and intensely human artifacts, and understanding their strengths and limitations is the final, crucial step in truly hearing the voices they contain. Their greatest power, the very reason we are so drawn to them, is also their most significant complication, their profound subjectivity. While an official chronicle written by a monk or a court scribe aims for a detached, factual account of events, the movement of armies, the duration of the siege, the outcome of the battle, a diary thrives on the personal. It gives us the emotional weather inside the fortress. It tells us not just that the siege lasted 120 days, but what it felt like to wake up on the 99th day, to see the hope drain from your child's eyes because the bread ration was cut again. This emotional truth is what official records systematically erase. They give us the skeleton of history, but the diaries put flesh on the bones, a heartbeat in the chest. They answer the question that dry statistics can never address. How did it feel? However, this incredible strength is a double-edged sword, because a diary is, by its nature, the perspective of a single individual. And that individual is not a representative sample of the entire besieged population. First and foremost, the very act of keeping a diary in the Middle Ages was a marker of privilege. Literacy was not widespread. It was largely confined to the clergy, the nobility, and a handful of wealthy merchants or skilled professionals like an apothecary or a clerk. The man meticulously describing the taste of leather soup was almost certainly not the common foot soldier who had been eating it for weeks. The noblewoman writing about her fears for her children's safety was experiencing a different kind of siege than the servant woman scrubbing the floors of the infirmary. The diaries, therefore, inevitably skew our view toward the experiences of the elite, the voices of the vast majority of people trapped in those fortresses, the common soldiers, the artisans, the peasants who sought refuge within the walls, are largely silent. Their suffering, their fears, their small acts of courage are often only glimpsed indirectly, reflected in the writings of their social superiors. This is a fundamental limitation. We are seeing the siege from the battlements and the Lord's chambers, but we are only rarely hearing the whispers from the barracks or the kitchens. Beyond the issue of social class, we must also consider the author's personal biases and intentions. A diary is never a completely neutral record. The author may have been writing with a specific audience in mind, perhaps future generations of their own family, which would naturally lead them to portray their own actions in a more favorable light. They might downplay moments of panic or cowardice and emphasize their own bravery and steadfastness. A Castellan's diary might subtly shift blame for a failed sally onto a subordinate knight. A noblewoman's account might exaggerate her own role in managing supplies to cement her legacy as a capable leader. There is also the very human tendency to interpret events through the lens of one's own beliefs and prejudices. An event that seemed like a miracle to a devoutly religious scribe might be recorded as a simple stroke of luck by a more pragmatic soldier. The diary presents not the truth, but a truth filtered through the personality, the social position, and the immediate circumstances of the writer. Furthermore, these accounts are often incomplete. They are snapshots, not a continuous film reel. A diarist might write fervently during the terrifying first week of the siege and the climactic final assault, but the long, grinding months in between might be recorded in sparse, repetitive entries or skipped altogether out of despair or sheer exhaustion. The diary might end abruptly, leaving us forever wondering about the fate of its author. Pages can be lost, damaged by water or fire, or rendered illegible by fading ink. What remains for historians is a puzzle with many of the most important pieces missing. This inherent fragmentation means that we can never reconstruct a complete and perfectly accurate timeline of daily life from a single diary alone. This is precisely why historians never treat a diary as a standalone source. Its true power is unlocked only when it is placed in conversation with other forms of evidence. Think of it as a triangulation of truth. The emotional, personal testimony of the diary is one point. The physical evidence uncovered by archaeologists, the remnants of the siege engines, the analysis of garbage pits to understand diet, the skeletal remains showing signs of violence or disease provides a second tangible point. The dry, impersonal facts from official chronicles and administrative records, like supply lists or letters between commanders, offer a third point of reference. It is at the intersection of these different sources that the most reliable picture of the past emerges. A diary entry describing a devastating famine is given immense weight when archaeologists find evidence of butchered horse and dog bones in layers corresponding to the final weeks of the siege. The official chronicle's date for the fall of the castle is confirmed by the diary's frantic final entry. By cross-referencing, historians can identify exaggerations, confirm key events, and fill in the gaps left by each individual source. Despite these necessary caveats, the ultimate value of these diaries is truly immeasurable. They accomplish something that no other historical document can. They give a voice to the individual experience of history. They transform the abstract casualty count, 300 defenders perished, into the specific, heartbreaking story of the young archer who wrote a final letter to his mother, or the little girl who died quietly in her sleep from hunger. They rescue history from the realm of generals and kings and return it to the people who actually lived it, who suffered, hoped, and endured within the stone walls. They remind us that history is not just a sequence of events, but a vast collection of human emotions. By approaching them with a critical eye, acknowledging both their profound insights and their inherent limitations, we do not diminish their power. Instead, we honor the complexity of the past and ensure that when we listen to these whispered voices, we are hearing them as clearly and truthfully as we possibly can. This careful, respectful analysis of the source itself is what allows the true legacy of the besieged mind to finally come into focus. What emerges so powerfully from these fragile pages is not just a story of medieval hardship, but a startlingly modern blueprint of the human psyche under extreme pressure. The psychological patterns meticulously documented by those trapped in their stone prisons, the descent into paranoia, the clinging to routine, the desperate search for meaning, are not relics of a distant past. They find eerie and immediate echoes in the experiences of prisoners of war in 20th century camps, where inmates would mark days on hidden calendars and create elaborate social structures to preserve their identity. They resonate with the accounts of astronauts on long-duration space missions, isolated in a metal capsule, who rely on rigid daily schedules and constant communication with ground control to combat the profound disorientation of their confinement. The same human responses to scarcity, fear, and the desperate need for hope appear to be hardwired, timeless constants that transcend the vast gulf of centuries and technology. The diaries teach us that resilience is not some magical quality possessed by a special few, nor is it the absence of fear. Instead, it is a practical set of behaviors, a conscious architecture of the mind built brick by brick each day. The most resilient individuals in those fortresses were not the ones who felt no terror, but those who found a way to function in spite of it. They understood the profound importance of routine, that the simple act of rising at the same time, of observing prayer hours, of performing a designated task, created a scaffold of normalcy over an abyss of chaos. This instinct is mirrored in modern therapeutic practices for trauma survivors, where establishing a predictable daily structure is a foundational step toward recovery. It is a way for the mind to assert control when all external control has been lost, a small but vital declaration that some order still remains. Perhaps the most critical lesson is the irreplaceable value of community. The Siege Diaries reveal in heartbreaking detail how social bonds could be both a source of terrible strain, as suspicion festered, and the very key to survival. When those bonds held, when people shared their last morsel of food or offered a word of comfort, they created a collective strength far greater than the sum of its parts. This is a truth understood by support groups today, where individuals facing similar adversities from illness to addiction find immense power in shared experience. The medieval fortress and the modern support group are vastly different settings, but the underlying principle is identical. We are social creatures, and our ability to endure suffering is magnified when we do not have to endure it alone. The sense of being part of a group with a common purpose, whether defending a castle or supporting each other through recovery, provides a meaning that can eclipse individual pain. This leads to the final and perhaps most profound insight from the besieged mind, the necessity of finding meaning in suffering. The defenders did not simply endure their ordeal, they constantly worked to frame it within a larger narrative. For some, this was a religious conviction, a belief that their suffering was a test of faith with a heavenly reward. For others, it was a patriotic duty or loyalty to their Lord. This act of meaning-making is a fundamental human need, and we see it in every extreme situation. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, wrote extensively about how those who could find a purpose, however small, were far more likely to survive the horrors of the concentration camps. The siege within is therefore a universal human experience. It is the internal battle to maintain one's humanity, one's sense of self, when external circumstances conspire to strip it away. It is a battle fought not with swords, but with the tools of routine, community, and narrative. By understanding these historical patterns, we gain more than just knowledge of the past. We acquire a deeper compassion for the human condition and a valuable lens through which to understand our own capacity and the capacity of others to endure the unendurable. The forgotten diaries of those trapped in medieval fortresses do far more than just recount history. They illuminate the enduring strength of the human spirit in its most raw and vulnerable state. From the initial, gut-wrenching shock of encirclement to the grim and disorienting aftermath of survival, these accounts reveal a world where the routines of daily life stubbornly persisted under the long, cold shadow of death. We have walked with these individuals through their darkest hours, witnessing how relentless hunger was met with breathtaking ingenuity, how paralyzing fear was countered by unwavering faith, and how the profound isolation of their stone prison was punctuated by fleeting yet powerful moments of human connection. The siege, as these pages testify, was never merely a military event defined by dates and tactics. It was a profound, all-encompassing human experience, a brutal but revealing laboratory of resilience that holds up a mirror to our own modern capacity to endure hardship, isolation, and uncertainty. As we gently close these fragile pages, the echoes of their voices linger, leaving us with a deeper, more humbled appreciation for the silent, internal battles fought behind those imposing stone walls. These were not just conflicts of sword and shield, but struggles of the heart and mind, battles that shaped not only the course of history, but also the very fabric of human character. The lessons etched in faded ink are timeless. They teach us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to take one more step despite it. They show us that community is our greatest fortress, and that even in the most confined of spaces, the human spirit can find a way to create light. Let these whispers from the past serve as a powerful reminder of the resilience that resides within us all. We would love to hear which aspect of siege life, the culinary ingenuity, the children's perspective, the role of faith, or something else entirely, most resonated with you. Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. To truly appreciate the power of these personal accounts, let's step away from the general patterns and focus on one remarkable individual, whose diary throws the human drama of a siege into sharp, unforgettable relief. We travel now to the year 1265, to the formidable cliffs of Dover, where Eleanor de Montfort, sister to King Henry III, found herself at the very center of a storm that was tearing England apart. Her journal, kept during a relentless siege of Dover Castle, is not just a historical document. It is a masterclass in leadership under fire, a portrait of a woman balancing the weight of a kingdom's conflict with the terrifying vulnerabilities of a wife and mother. What makes Eleanor's story so compelling is her unique position. She was no passive observer trapped by circumstance. She was an active, decisive commander, holding a vital royal fortress for her husband, Simon de Montfort, the leader of a rebellion against her own brother, the king. Her diary, therefore, is written from a breathtakingly precarious vantage point, where family loyalty and political allegiance had become irreconcilable opposites. The pressure she describes is almost unimaginable. With her husband captured and imprisoned after the Battle of Lewes, the entire rebel cause now rested on her ability to hold Dover, the symbolic key to England. Her entries reveal the immense psychological toll of this responsibility. She writes with startling candor about the bone-deep fatigue that comes from making life or death decisions every single day. One entry might detail her inspection of the castle's weakened southern wall, her mind racing with calculations about where to station her limited number of archers. The very next paragraph could dissolve into a mother's frantic worry about her children's coughs, fearing the damp castle air would sicken them. This constant oscillation between the strategic and the deeply personal is what gives her diary its raw, powerful humanity. She couldn't afford to compartmentalize. The fate of her family was literally tied to the strength of the stone walls around them. Eleanor's strategic genius shines through in her meticulous management of the castle's morale, a resource she understood to be as critical as food or weapons. One of her most fascinating decisions, detailed over several entries, concerned the castle's substantial store of wine. While a less perceptive leader might have hoarded it for the elite or simply rationed it strictly as a commodity, Eleanor recognized its deeper value. She instituted a careful, almost ceremonial distribution of small amounts of wine to the garrison and key workers on particularly difficult days after a long night of repelling an attack, or when news from the outside was especially grim. Her diary explains this not as an indulgence but as a calculated psychological tool. She understood that the simple act of sharing a cup of wine could foster a sense of shared purpose and temporary normalcy, a brief reminder of the civilized world they were fighting to preserve. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about her understanding that an army fights not just with its muscles, but with its spirit. Beyond the walls, she was engaged in a nerve-wracking diplomatic duel. Her husband's life hung in the balance, and she was simultaneously negotiating with her royal brother, King Henry, for Simon's release, while also directing the defense against the king's forces. Her journal entries from this period are a masterclass in political tension. She describes the arrival of messengers from the royal camp, their words laced with both threat and promise. She had to parse every phrase, every nuance for signs of her brother's true intentions. Was he sincere in his offers, or was he simply playing for time, waiting for her garrison to starve? Writing by candlelight, she weighed the unbearable choice between surrendering the castle to save her husband or holding firm for his political cause, a decision that could ultimately lead to his execution. This blend of high-stakes statecraft with the most intimate of personal stakes makes her account utterly unique. Eleanor de Montfort's journal ultimately stands as a powerful testament to the individual stories that give history its heartbeat. It forces us to move beyond the simple labels of rebel and royalist and see the human being at the center of the storm. Her experience proves that during a siege, political survival and personal survival are not separate battles. They are one and the same, fought with every ounce of courage, wisdom, and resilience a person can muster. Her voice, preserved across the centuries, encourages us to look deeper, to seek out the other hidden narratives waiting in the archives, reminding us that behind every grand event of history, there are countless untold stories of individuals who lived, feared, and hoped just as we do